The chipped porcelain mug felt unnaturally cold against Joseph Moretti. His palm, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat that had settled over the city, like a damp wool blanket. Outside, the sky was a bruised, sullen grey, the kind that promised rain but delivered only a humid oppression. He, deep in staring at the same spot on the peeling wallpaper for what felt like hours, a faded floral pattern that had once lightly whispered of springtime cheer but now merely hinted at decay. Miso, his ginger tabby, a creature of such magnificent indifference, was currently engaged in a vigorous grooming session on the worn armchair, his purr a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. The only consistent sound in the increasingly discordant symphony of Joseph's life. The strangeness had begun subtly like a whisper in a crowded room, easily dismissed. It was Miso first. The cat, usually a creature of impeccable routine, dawn wake, up nudges, mid-morning sunbeam naps, evening zoomies had started deviating. He'd spent hours staring at empty corners of the apartment, his emerald eyes wide and unblinking, as if witnessing some unseen spectacle. Then there were the whispers, faint at first, like the rustle of dry leaves that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Joseph, a man whose life had been meticulously ordered, a career built on the predictable rhythms of accounting, found himself increasingly unnerved. He'd tried to rationalize it, blaming stress, lack of sleep, the oppressive humidity. But the feeling persisted, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the distinct impression of being watched. Last Tuesday the strangeness had escalated, shedding its subtle guise for something more audacious. Joseph had been at the grocery store, navigating the fluorescent, lit aisles when he'd seen him, across the produce section selecting avocados with the same deliberate, almost fussy precision that Joseph himself employed, stood a man. He was Joseph. Height, Joseph. Hess build, even wearing a similar shade of faded blue shirt, but it was the face that had sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror through him. It was Joseph's face, yet subtly wrong, like a poorly rendered photocopy. The eyes were too close. Set, the smile, when he offered a polite nod to a passing shopper, was a fraction too wide, too vacant. Joseph had frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ducked behind a towering display of canned tomatoes. Peeking out a moment later, the man was gone. The incident had lodged itself in Joseph's mind, a persistent splinter. He found himself looking over his shoulder, scrutinizing strangers in the street, a newfound paranoia blooming in the arid soil of his once ordered existence. He even started to spy on his own reflection, scrutinizing the subtle shifts in his features, convinced he was missing some tail sign, some creeping corruption. He'd spent 10-15 minutes in the bathroom mirror, turning his head this way and that. A stranger in his own skin. Miso, sensing his agitation, would often rub against his legs, a silent, furry anchor in the rising tide of his unease. But even Miso's comforting presence seemed tinged with an odd awareness now, his gaze often lingering on Joseph with an intensity that felt less like affection and more like assessment. Then came the package. It had arrived yesterday, a plain brown box with no return address, just his name and address scrawled in jagged, unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, nestled amongst crumpled packing paper, was a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was beautiful, unsettlingly so, its tiny eyes seeming to follow him as he turned it over in his hands. A faint cloying scent clung to it, something like old potpourri and something else, something distinctly unpleasant, like decaying leaves after a prolonged rain. He deplaced it on the mantelpiece, a curious, morbid ornament. The next morning, the bird was gone, and Miso was different. His fur, once a vibrant ginger, seemed to have dulled, his movements sluggish. He still purred, but it was a hollow sound devoid of its usual warmth. Joseph felt a chilling certainty crystallize within him. The man in the grocery store, the package, the disappearing bird, Miso's subtle shift. Hui, it was all connected. He was no longer alone in his own life. Something was trying to replace him. The sheer audacity of it, the meticulous, insidious nature of the attempted usurpation was more terrifying than any sudden, violent assault. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't half understand, a game where the rules were being rewritten by an unseen hand, and the prize was his very existence. He counted 44 seconds as he watched Miso lick a paw, his gaze drifting to the empty space on the mantelpiece. The air in the apartment felt thick, charged with an unseen, malevolent energy. The phantom scent of decaying leaves clung to the air, a phantom limb of aroma that Joseph Moretti couldn't shake. it was strongest, he noticed with a fresh wave of unease, whenever he was in the vicinity of the mantelpiece, the now empty spot where the carved bird had perched. He'd spent the better part of the morning meticulously cleaning the apartment, a desperate attempt to scrub away the encroaching dread. He vacuumed with a ferocity that threatened to tear the worn carpet, dusted surfaces until they gleamed under the weak, grey light, and even scrubbed the grout in the bathroom tiles, a Sisyphean task that yielded only the illusion of cleanliness. Miso, however, remained apathetic to his efforts, his ginger fur now tinged with a peculiar, almost muddy hue, his emerald eyes perpetually half-lidded, as if perpetually on the verge of sleep. Joseph found himself drawn to the windows, not to admire the city's sullen skyline, but to scan the street below, his gaze darting from face to face, searching for that unnervingly familiar countenance. He half expected to see himself, lurking in the shadows, observing his own frantic attempts to maintain normalcy. The thought was a cold serpent coiling in his gut. He was beginning to feel like a spy in his own life, constantly on the lookout for the infiltrator, the uncanny doppelganger who seemed to be slowly, systematically erasing him. The meticulous nature of it all was what truly unnerved him. This wasn't a clumsy imitation. It was a calculated, almost artistic endeavor. The missing bird, the subtle alteration in Miso's appearance, the persistent phantom odofiction. These were not random occurrences. They were brushstrokes on a canvas of his unraveling reality. He remembered his grandmother, a woman whose mind had been a labyrinth of forgotten memories and whispered superstitions. She'd always warned him about shadow selves, about mirrors that held more than just reflections. He dismissed them then as the ramblings of an aging mind. Now they echoed with a chilling prescience. He caught his reflection in the darkened glass of the television screen and flinched. For a fleeting, terrifying instant, the face staring back wasn't quite his own. The jawline was a fraction too sharp. The eyes held a glint of something predatory, something ancient. He blinked, and the familiar worried lines of his own face returned. But the image lingered, a spectre superimposed onto his own consciousness. He felt a profound disconnect, as if his very essence was fraying at the edges. The doppelganger wasn't just a physical manifestation, it was an encroaching consciousness, a parasitic entity seeking to usurp his identity from the inside out. He felt a desperate urge to scream, to shatter the illusion, but his throat constricted, leaving him trapped in a suffocating silence. Later that evening, as Joseph sat hunched over his lukewarm dinner, a single, insistent meow broke through his reverie. Miso was at the door, not his usual expectant meow for food, but a low, guttural sound that raised the hairs on Joseph's arms. He'd never heard Miso make a sound like that before. It was a sound of warning, of pure, unadulterated terror. He pushed his plate away, the food suddenly tasting like ash. He stood and approached the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. He hesitated, the silence stretching, pregnant with unspoken threat. Then, from the other side of the door, came another sound, a soft, rhythmic scratching, accompanied by a low, almost inaudible hum. It was a sound that felt sickeningly familiar, a sound that burrowed deep into his bones. It was the sound of the carved wooden bird being scratched against the paint, but the bird was gone, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that the hand doing the scratching was not his own. The rhythmic scratching at the door continued, a maddening, insistent tattoo against the wood, a sound that vibrated not just in Joseph Moretti's ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. It was the sound of the phantom bird, the one that had vanished from the mantelpiece, now manifesting its malevolent presence in the most direct, the most terrifying way possible. He stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the doorknob, the lukewarm remnants of his dinner forgotten, curdling in his stomach. The low, guttural hum that accompanied the scratching was even more disturbing, a discordant vibration that felt less like a sound and more like a physical sensation, a tremor of the unnatural. Miso, usually so quick to vocalize his displeasure or demand attention, was utterly silent, a quivering ginger statue pressed against Joseph's legs, his fur bristling like a startled porcupine. Joseph's mind, usually a well-ordered ledger of debits and credits, was now a chaotic ledger of escalating dread. He replayed the events of the past few days, the unsettling doppelganger in the grocery store, the phantom scent of decay, the disappearing bird, Miso's subtle, alarming transformation. Each element, isolated, might have been dismissed as coincidence or stress. But woven together, they formed a tapestry of escalating horror, a chilling narrative of his own undoing. He felt a primal urge to flee, to bolt from the apartment, to disappear into the anonymity of the city. But a morbid fascination, a desperate need to confront the source of his terror, held him captive. He took a shallow, ragged breath, the air thick with the phantom scent of decay, now amplified by the unseen presence just beyond the door. Slowly, agonizingly, Joseph's fingers tightened around the doorknob. It felt slick and cold, as if slicked with an unseen moisture. He could feel the vibrations of the scratching through the metal, a visceral connection to whatever or whoever was on the other side. He imagined the doppelganger, his own face twisted into a grotesque caricature of curiosity, waiting to be let in. He pictured those two close eyes, the too-wide smile now tinged with a victorious malice. He was a spy in his own life, and the enemy had finally found the breach. He braced himself, his knuckles white, and slowly, deliberately turned the knob. The latch clicked open with an unnervingly loud report in the otherwise silent apartment. He pulled the door inward, his gaze fixed on the sliver of hallway visible. There was nothing there. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim, flickering light of the communal bulb. No carved bird, no spectral doppelganger, just the peeling paint, the stained linoleum, and the oppressive silence. Joseph stepped forward, his eyes scanning the floor, the walls, the ceiling. He saw only the mundane detritus of apartment living. He even checked the small alcove where the mail was usually delivered, his heart sinking with a mixture of relief and profound disappointment. He was losing his mind. The phantom scratching, the hum, the bird's shooey, it was all a delusion, a desperate projection of his own disintegrating sanity. As he turned back into the apartment, a faint metallic glint on the floor near the threshold caught his eye. He bent down, his breath catching in his throat. It was a single, thin, almost invisible strand of ginger-colored hair. It was identical to Miso's fur, but it felt wrong. It was unnaturally stiff, almost brittle, and when he touched it, it crumbled to dust between his fingertips. The phantom scent of decay, he realized with a fresh wave of horror, was not just in the air. It was hid within Miso. The disintegration of the ginger hair, like a miniature sandcastle collapsing under an invisible tide, sent a fresh tremor of dread through Joseph Moretti. It wasn't just a delusion. The evidence, however, ephemeral, was undeniable. He watched Miso, who had finally relaxed his rigid posture, now languidly stretching on the rug, his movements fluid but lacking their usual vibrant energy. That muddy hue to his fur seemed more pronounced in the dim lamplight, a subtle but profound alteration that spoke of an internal rot. Joseph felt a desperate, almost animalistic urge to scrutinize Miso closer, to prod and poke and analyze, but he knew with a bone-deep certainty that whatever was happening was beyond the realm of simple veterinary science. He found himself pacing the confines of the apartment again, his footsteps heavy on the worn floorboards, each creak a betrayal. He felt like a prisoner in his own home. The walls that once offered comfort now felt like the bars of a cage. The doppelganger, the phantom bird, the crumbling hair, these were not isolated incidents. They were escalating maneuvers in a silent, insidious war for his identity. He was a spy in his own skin, and the enemy was not just outside, but seeping in, altering the very fabric of his life, starting with the creature he'd always considered a constant, a furry, purring anchor in the unpredictable currents of existence. He caught Miso watching him, those half-lidded emerald eyes holding a depth that seemed to absorb the room's meager light. There was no recognition in them, no familiar warmth, just a vast, ancient indifference that mirrored the unsettling emptiness he'd glimpsed in the phantom's reflection. Joseph's gaze drifted to the chipped porcelain mug still sitting on the coffee table, a forgotten sentinel of his earlier anxiety. He picked it up, the cold ceramic a stark contrast to the feverish heat prickling his skin. He brought it to his lips, a desperate, unthinking act, seeking some familiar sensation, some grounding taste. What he tasted, however, was far from familiar. It was a faint, coppery tang, like licking a forgotten penny mingling with the cloying sweetness of decay. He gagged, spitting the contents into the sink, the foulness coating his tongue. It was the same scent that had clung to the wooden bird, the scent that seemed to emanate from Miso himself. This was not just a psychological assault. It was a physical one, a poisoning of his senses, a corruption of the very air he breathed. He knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the entity orchestrating this slow, agonizing unraveling was not content with merely impersonating him. It was actively working to destroy him, to erase every trace of Joseph Moretti from existence, starting with the subtle, almost imperceptible changes it was inflicting on his beloved, now terrifyingly altered, cat. The world outside the apartment, with its indifferent sky and bustling streets, felt a million miles away, a realm of normalcy that was rapidly receding, leaving him stranded in a nightmare crafted from his own fears. The metallic tang on Joseph, Moretti's tongue lingered, a vile aftertaste that no amount of frantic rinsing could erase. It was the taste of his own undoing, a sensory testament to the insidious invasion that had begun with a phantom bird and was now manifesting as a creeping corruption within his familiar ginger companion. He watched Miso, who had curled into a tight, unmoving ball on the armchair, his breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. The muddy hue of his fur seemed to have deepened, coalescing into patches that looked disturbingly like old, dried mud. Joseph felt a surge of something akin to panic, a primal fear that threatened to consume him. He was no longer just a witness to his own potential replacement, he was a participant in a grotesque charade, his very senses being twisted and manipulated to fit the narrative of his erasure. He found himself staring at the apartment door again, not with fear, but with a cold, hard resolve. The phantom scratching had ceased, the unnerving hum had faded, but the threat remained. A palpable entity lurking just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. He was a spy whose mission had become a desperate fight for survival. He had to understand the nature of this entity, its motives, its weaknesses. He remembered his grandmother's cryptic pronouncements about shadow selves and the porous nature of reality. Perhaps she hadn't been rambling after all. Perhaps there were cracks in the world through which things like this could seep. He moved to the small, cluttered desk in the corner, pulling out a worn notebook and a pen. His accounting days had trained him in methodical documentation, in the meticulous recording of facts. Now he would apply those skills to this horrifying new reality. He began to write, his hand shaking at first, then steadier as he forced himself to focus. He detailed the appearance of the doppelganger, the unsettling details of its features, the precise moment he'd first seen it. He described the phantom scent, the metallic taste, the vanishing bird, and the alarming changes in Miso. He even sketched the crude, unsettling outline of the wooden bird, trying to capture its unsettling aura. As he wrote, he felt a strange sense of detachment, as if he were observing these events from a great distance, a detached scientist meticulously cataloguing a specimen. But the truth was, he was the specimen. He was the subject of this horrifying experiment. He glanced at Miso, who had stirred, lifting his head with a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes, usually a vibrant emerald, now held a dull, opaque sheen, like polished obsidian. Joseph felt a chill crawl up his spine. Miso wasn't just changing. He was becoming something else entirely, and Joseph knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and strangely empowering, that the next move was his. He had to become the spy who discovered the enemy's true face, the one that was slowly, inexorably becoming his own. The act of writing, of meticulously documenting the unfolding nightmare, had a strangely calming effect on Joseph Moretti, a brittle sort of peace that settled over him like a shroud. His notebook lay open, filled with his spidery script, a testament to the encroaching madness. He had detailed the doppelganger's unnervingly familiar yet subtly alien features. The phantom scent that clung to everything like a parasitic fog, and the alarming transformation of Miso. The cat, still a study in ginger. Muddy Hughes now sat with his back to Joseph, a rigid statue of feline disquiet. His tail, usually a languid question mark, was now tucked tightly beneath him, a sign of profound unease. Joseph, the accidental spy in his own life, felt a gnawing suspicion that Miso's altered state was not merely a symptom, but a key. He recalled the distinct, almost imperceptible shift in Miso's purr after the incident with the wooden bird. It had gone from a comforting rumble to a hollow, mechanical thrumming. Now there was no purr at all, only a shallow, raspy inhale and exhale. Joseph, driven by a desperate need for concrete answers, edged closer, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He reached out a hesitant hand, intending to stroke Miso's back, to offer some semblance of comfort, but Miso flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk that sent a ripple through his unnaturally stiffened fur. Joseph's fingers brushed against Miso's flank, and he recoiled. The fur felt wrong. It was dry, brittle, and possessed a texture that was disturbingly like sun-bleached straw. A few strands detached themselves and floated down, disintegrating into dust before they even touched the floor. This wasn't just a disease, it was an unraveling, a slow, deliberate dismantling of his companion, and by extension of himself. The doppelganger, the phantom bird, the scent to it. They were all part of a calculated process, a meticulous dismantling of Joseph's reality, piece by agonizing piece. He felt a cold dread seep into him, a realization that the entity wasn't just trying to replace him. It was trying to fully annihilate him, to overwrite his existence with a hollow echo. He looked at his notebook, at the words he had painstakingly written, and understood. He was documenting his own erasure. He was a spy observing the meticulous dismantling of his own life, a life that was becoming increasingly indistinguishable from the silent, unsettling presence that now occupied his cat's form. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a stage set for his own disappearance, and the audience was unseen but undeniably present, waiting for the final act. The crumbling texture of Miso's fur, the way it yielded to dust at the slightest touch, was a visceral testament to the horrifying truth Joseph Moretti had been trying to deny. It was a process of decay, a meticulous unmaking that mirrored the insidious unraveling of his own sense of self. He watched, mesmerized and horrified, as Miso shifted, a slow, jerky movement that lacked the fluid grace of his former feline self. The cat's spine seemed unnaturally prominent beneath the dry, brittle fur, each vertebra a sharp ridge under Joseph's increasingly anxious gaze. The phantom scent, once confined to the apartment's periphery, now seemed to emanate directly from Miso, a cloying sweetness underscored by the unmistakable aroma of rot, as if the cat itself was becoming a vessel for decay. Joseph's mind, a battlefield of logic and terror, grappled with the implications. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about Miso. His companion, his silent confidant, was being systematically dismantled from the inside out, his vibrant ginger coat turning to dust, his comforting purr replaced by the rasp of shallow breaths. The doppelganger, the phantom bird, the metallic taste thoof, they were all part of this grand, horrifying design. Joseph felt a growing certainty that the entity wasn't interested in simply thought impersonating him. It was interested in erasing him, in leaving behind a hollowed-out shell, a distorted echo of his former life. He was a spy, yes, but his mission had shifted from observation to a desperate, solitary fight for survival, not just for himself, but for the very memory of who he was. He looked at his notebook, at the meticulous, almost frantic entries detailing the descent. He had documented the phantom bird, the unnerving presence in the grocery store, the metallic tang that now seemed to coat his very being. He had described Miso's transformation, the brittle fur, the absent purr, the encroaching smell of decay. Each word was a bulwark against the encroaching oblivion, a desperate attempt to anchor himself in reality. But the reality he was trying to anchor himself to was dissolving around him. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a terrifying understanding that he was utterly alone in this battle. He glanced at Miso again. The cat's eyes, those once vibrant emerald pools, were now clouded, opaque, reflecting the dim light with a disturbing lack of depth. They held no recognition, no affection, only a vast, unsettling emptiness. Joseph knew then, with a chilling certainty, that the entity was not just trying to replace him, it was trying to consume him, to absorb his very essence, leaving behind only a decaying husk, a monument to his own erasure. The apartment, once his sanctuary, had become a tomb, and he was its sole terrified occupant, a spy trapped in the ruins of his own life. The opaque, clouded gaze of Miso was a mirror reflecting Joseph Moretti's deepest fears, a silent confirmation that the line between man and cat, between reality and nightmare, had irrevocably blurred. The phantom scent of decay, once a subtle perfume of dread, now hung thick and heavy in the air, a suffocating miasma that seemed to emanate from Miso's very being. Joseph watched as the cat, with a slow, deliberate movement that was unnervingly unfeline, turned its head towards him. The movement was not a fluid arc, but a series of disjointed clicks and creaks, like ancient gears grinding into motion. Joseph's own joints felt stiff in sympathy, his muscles protesting as if anticipating a similar skeletal betrayal. He felt a primal urge to flee, to shatter the oppressive stillness of the apartment, and escape into the indifferent anonymity of the city, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, his body a prisoner to the unfolding horror. He was a spy caught behind enemy lines, his mission compromised, his objective now reduced to mere survival. He looked down at his notebook, its pages filled with his frantic scrawl, a chronicle of his descent. He had documented the doppelganger, the phantom bird, the metallic taste, the crumbling fur. Now, he felt compelled to add another detail, a detail that sent a fresh wave of icy dread through him. Miso's eyes. They were no longer reflecting light. They were absorbing it. Two tiny voids in a face that was slowly, horrifyingly, losing its definition. Joseph's mind, a fractured landscape of logic and terror, began to piece together the horrifying mosaic. The doppelganger wasn't just a physical manifestation, it was an entity, a force of unmaking, and Miso was its primary conduit, its unwitting accomplice. The cat's transformation was a prelude, a slow, deliberate dismantling of a familiar, beloved form, preparing the way for something else, something alien and terrifying to take root. Joseph felt a profound sense of helplessness wash over him, the cold, sterile realization that he was not just fighting for his own identity, but for the very soul of his companion. He was a spy witnessing the slow, agonizing death of his own reality. And the enemy was not a distant threat, but a creeping internal corruption, wearing the familiar guise of his beloved pet. The apartment, once a haven, had become a charnel house, and he was trapped within its decaying walls, a lone observer of his own annihilation. The void in Miso's eyes, those twin abysses that seemed to swallow the meager light of the apartment, was a silent scream that echoed in Joseph Moretti's soul. The phantom scent of decay, once a lingering miasma, had intensified, coalescing into a palpable presence, a suffocating blanket that pressed in on him from all sides. He watched, his breath shallow, as Miso's form began to subtly shift. It was not a dramatic metamorphosis, but a series of minute, unsettling alterations. The angles of his jaw seemed to sharpen, the sleekness of his once supple form giving way to a gaunt, almost skeletal frame. The ginger, muddy hue of his fur was now interspersed with patches of a disturbing ashen grey, like dried ash clinging to dying embers. Joseph felt a cold, precise understanding bloom in the chaotic garden of his fear. The doppelganger wasn't merely a physical duplicate. It was a puppet master, manipulating reality from the shadows, using Miso as its initial canvas, its testing ground. The cat's slow, agonizing transformation was a grim rehearsal for Joseph's own. He was a spy, yes, but his mission had devolved into a desperate, solitary struggle against an enemy that was not only external but was actively consuming his world from within. He looked at his notebook, the pages filled with his meticulous yet increasingly futile documentation. He had chronicled the phantom bird, the uncanny doppelganger, the metallic taste, the crumbling fur. Now he felt an overwhelming compulsion to record the impossible, the chilling metamorphosis unfolding before his eyes. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the entity was not content with simply impersonating him. It aimed for obliteration, for the complete erasure of Joseph Moretti from existence, leaving behind only a hollow echo, a decaying monument to his former self. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a meticulously crafted trap, its walls closing in, its silence amplifying the grotesque symphony of Miso's unmaking. He caught his own reflection in the darkened glass of a picture frame. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, the face staring back was not his own. The eyes were darker, deeper, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile played on lips that seemed just a fraction too wide. He blinked, and his own familiar, terrified face returned. But the image, the chilling premonition, was seared into his consciousness. He was no longer just a spy, he was the target, and the final act of his erasure was about to begin. The phantom scent of decay, now a suffocating shroud, clung to Joseph Moretti like a second skin, a visceral reminder of the unmaking that had begun with a spectral bird and culminated in the horrifying metamorphosis of his ginger companion. Miso, or what remained of him, was no longer a cat in any recognizable sense. His form had elongated, his limbs twisting at unnatural angles, his ginger, muddy fur now interspersed with patches of ashen grey that resembled dried bone dust. The skeletal frame, once subtly apparent, was now starkly defined, a macabre sculpture of hollowed-out existence. The eyes, those twin voids that had swallowed light and offered only emptiness, were now sunken deeper, rimmed with a dark, bruised tissue that seemed to weep a viscous, dark fluid. Joseph, the accidental spy in his own life, felt a chilling sense of finality descend. His meticulously documented descent, the frantic entries in his notebook chronicling the doppelganger, the phantom bird, the metallic taste, the crumbling fur, now seemed like the futile scribblings of a man watching his own life being meticulously erased. The entity, the force of unmaking, had completed its initial phase. Miso was no longer a conduit, he was a manifestation, a grotesque echo of Joseph's own impending dissolution. He looked at his reflection in the darkened glass of the picture frame, the image of the doppelganger, his own face twisted into a predatory smile, now superimposed with a horrifying clarity. The eyes were indeed darker, deeper, and that too-wide smile was no longer a fleeting premonition, but a chillingly present reality. He felt a profound disconnect, as if his consciousness was being slowly peeled away from his physical form. The apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a carefully constructed stage set, its walls closing in, its silence amplifying the rasping inhuman breaths that emanated from the thing that had once been Miso. He knew, with a certainty that transcended rational thought, that the doppelganger was not just an impersonator, but an usurper, a creature that fed on identity, on the very essence of being. His fight for survival had been a futile, delaying tactic. The entity had already won. It had infiltrated his life, corrupted his companion, and was now poised to fully inhabit his own skin. He could feel the edges of his consciousness fraying, the familiar landscape of his memories dissolving into a chaotic ashen grey. The final act was not one of violence, but of insidious absorption, a quiet, terrifying erasure. He was no longer Joseph Moretti, the meticulous accountant. He was becoming the ghost in his own narrative, a spy who had finally uncovered the enemy, only to discover it was already him.